Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Dr. Akash Show. Now, my name is Dr. Akash Bajaj, and I am a triple board certified physician, and I'm here to help you focus on rituals and routines to keep you resilient and robust. So today's topic is one of the most fundamental hormones that we have in our body that is literally life-saving. But also, if it gets out of control, can be very damaging to our health and can actually take years off of your life. This is one of those hormones that's so finely balanced, and we need to really focus on this as much as possible to maintain your path to optimization. Now, that hormone is cortisol. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about what cortisol is, why it's important when we understand its effects and what it does for our body, what can happen with negative levels of cortisol when it gets out of control or is chronically elevated, and then finally, rituals and routines that you can focus on to maintain your levels and manage your levels to just have the optimal outcome that you can possibly have for your life. So let's get into it. But before we start, if you find any value in this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share this episode as well as this podcast to other like-minded individuals that may benefit from this. Now, cortisol. We've all maybe heard the term cortisol. Maybe we understand what it does. Maybe we don't. But most importantly, we've always been told that cortisol can have negative effects. But there's a ton of positive effects with proper cortisol management and proper cortisol activation that I want you to be aware of so you can understand and appreciate how important this hormone is. And then we can talk about how we can regulate it so it doesn't get out of control. The first thing that cortisol does for our bodies is it mobilizes energy sources. Now, what does this mean? Well, if you encounter a situation where you need energy quickly, something life-saving or something life-threatening, cortisol goes up, and this has the ability to increase blood glucose into your bloodstream right away, and that basically acts like fuel for your body. The way that cortisol does this is by breaking down glucose storage in the liver called glycogen and allowing that glycogen to then become glucose that provides energy for you now. Immediate energy to immediately help you get out of a threatening situation. The second thing that cortisol does for us is it assists with metabolic regulation. Now, what does this really mean? Well, basically what it allows us to do is activate and release more energy sources from your body's fat stores. This is called lipolysis. Basically, when cortisol goes up in an acute setting, your fat begins to break down, releasing energy to be used right away. The other thing that it can do from a metabolic regulation standpoint is it prevents glucose from being taken up into cells in the peripheral tissues where you may not necessarily need it right away. These two things together help to further increase blood glucose levels, allowing you to have access to energy quickly to, again, get yourself out of that life-threatening situation or get yourself towards safety or doing whatever you need to do to remove yourself from this dangerous situation or perceived dangerous situation. Now, another thing that cortisol can do for us, this is number 3, again, keeping in mind the overall theme here, which is when cortisol goes up in an acute short-term setting, the goal is to increase energy overall to allow yourself to remove yourself from danger. It's the best way to think about this. So along those lines, it can actually suppress your immune system activity. Now, why would this be helpful? Well, if you think about it, your immune system is a whole other set of chemical reactions and systems and activities and processes going on in your body simultaneously. Now, if we can turn that down or turn that off in the short run, then all of the energy required to kind of keep that immune system active has now been released and freed up for other things. So again, if you're in an acute situation, and think about this back in the kind of more primitive days of mankind, if you're staring at a lion and that lion starts charging at you, you probably don't need to worry about getting a cold at that point or maybe having a strong immune system so you don't get sick, right? For example, you probably need all of your energy sources maintained with immediate activity and immediate access so you can escape that situation first and foremost and survive. And at that point, your immune system can kind of reactivate and keep doing what it needs to do. So along those lines, in today's world, a real threat or a perceived threat can increase cortisol levels, which will decrease your immune system activity in the short run for the reasons I just discussed. But interestingly, in the short term, cortisol, when it does this, can actually have an anti-inflammatory effect as well, which is a good thing. So an anti-inflammatory effect in the short run will allow you to minimize inflammatory responses, which will only further improve your ability to move quickly, get out of the way, stay functional, stay active, and get yourself out of harm. Cortisol also plays a very important role in the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm in your body is primarily what's responsible for waking you up in the morning, keeping you awake at day, and then allowing you to calm everything down and go to sleep at night. So you have a certain set of hormones and kind of physiological activity and reactions that occur in the morning, and that allows your body and your physiology to get activated to move forward. And then you have an opposite and kind of opposing set of chemical reactions and hormonal increases and decreases in the evening to actually create the complete opposite effect, calm everything down, allowing you to go to sleep. In the evening, one very common chemical that you may have heard of to help promote sleep is melatonin. Now, in the morning, kind of the counterpart to something like that is cortisol. Ideally, we want our cortisol levels to be highest in the morning time, and that allows your body's physiology to kind of get activated, get stimulated, everything inside to kind of wake up and get you on and about your day. Now, cortisol possesses what we call a diurnal pattern, and a diurnal pattern basically means it's highest in the morning and slowly goes down during the course of the day, and hopefully and ideally in the evening, you have the lowest levels of cortisol, allowing you to kind of minimize those stimulating processes and reactions and allowing you to move towards more of a restful state. Now, because cortisol does possess a diurnal pattern, it's very important when you measure cortisol, when you're trying to determine your levels, to measure it in a diurnal pattern as well, meaning you want to take one measurement in the morning right upon awakening, and then about 12 hours later, you want a second measurement, and you want to compare those two levels. Ideally, you want the morning level to be the highest, and you want the evening level to be significantly lower. So you have a proper and kind of normal cortisol curve. Oftentimes, what you'll see is that diurnal pattern will be reversed. And again, the only way to find that out is by measuring in those 2 points. Now, if it's reversed, which you may notice just from your day-to-day, practically speaking, is maybe you're so exhausted and you're so tired, but you just can't fall asleep at night, and you kind of stay awake all night, tossing and turning. Next thing you know, it's time to wake up to get your day started, and you're just dragging yourself through the day exhausted. That might be an indication of a flipped cortisol curve, and that's typically what we call being tired and wired at night. So if this sounds like something you're dealing with, find a professional who's very competent in this space and see if they can give you an appropriate measurement, for example, with cortisol. Look at the diurnal pattern. Cortisol is very, very tightly regulated, guys. It's one of these hormones that's super tightly regulated in a perfect state in our bodies. Several different organ systems are involved to maintain cortisol levels where they should be. Your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your adrenal glands, just to name a few, all play a very important role in maintaining your cortisol levels. And make no mistake about it, cortisol has a lot of positive effects, much more than people talk about, and it is frankly essential for survival. If you don't have the ability to have a cortisol response, your ability to survive depends on that. It literally is the hormone that allows your body to adapt to a stress response. And we have stress responses all around us every day. Real, like physical stress responses, or perceived, more psychological stress responses, which we'll talk about momentarily. So with all this great talk about cortisol, why does it get such a bad rap? What's the big deal about cortisol? Well, here's the thing. Cortisol has always been intended to be a very quick and short-acting hormone, meaning you get yourself in a difficult situation, you have that tiger chasing you down the tundra, you're staring at a lion in the face, and you need to run on top of that rock as quickly as possible. You need cortisol activated, right? But the problem in today's society is we have so many perceived threats. We have so many perceived sources of stress. This can lead to not only things like anxiety, depression, chronic insomnia, fatigue, mood changes, etc., but it can also lead to chronic cortisol release. And when you have chronic and ongoing elevated cortisol levels, that's where the problem lies. So I want to make this very clear. Cortisol has a lot of positive effects, like what we just talked about, but it's intended to be something very short acting and very quick onset and very quick offset. The problem arises when we allow ourselves to have perceived psychological threats or actual physical threats to become so chronic and long-term that our cortisol responds in kind and stays elevated for prolonged periods of time. And remember, your subconscious and your conscious mind, they act together very, very closely. And if you're constantly feeling like you're under threat or you're placing all this psychological stress on yourself, your subconscious mind doesn't know the difference, and it truly believes that you have an ongoing stressful situation or an ongoing threat. And then both of those systems together are going to help elevate your cortisol chronically. And that's where the problem lies. So what exactly is the problem of chronic cortisol elevation? Well, the first thing is, remember what I said about cortisol and your immune system. In an acute setting, we want to turn off the immune system, utilize that extra energy, and get to safety. But in a chronic setting, if you're constantly turning off your immune system response, now you're suppressing your immune system on a regular basis. Now you're going to be much more prone to infections, delayed wound healing, getting sick all the time, all these types of things. So have you ever noticed how when you're really stressed out, you're not sleeping, maybe you have a deadline you're trying to meet, maybe you have a big exam coming up, maybe you have a personal life stressor that's just keeping you on edge, maybe you lost your job, maybe you're going through a divorce, whatever the case may be. Have you ever noticed how you tend to get more sick? Well, this is one of the reasons why. Because your immune system is actually suppressed by that chronic stress, and most importantly, by the lack of stress management and proper coping skills that you begin to become more susceptible to infections and sickness and delayed wound healing. So for no reason other than this is a great reason to remember when you think about cortisol and stress and why you should really develop proper coping mechanisms for stress to maintain. And we will talk more about how to do that momentarily. Now, metabolic regulation. Remember how we discussed metabolic regulation allows your body to increase levels of glucose in the blood by preventing glucose uptake into cells and freeing up more glucose from your fat cells and your adipose. Well, if that becomes chronic, now that glucose cannot be taken up into cells, and you have elevated levels of glucose in your blood chronically. And that, my friends, is called diabetes. So chronically elevated levels of cortisol increase insulin resistance, decrease glucose uptake, and increase your potential to develop diabetes. This is a very big deal. So these two reasons alone combined, you are more prone to infections and you can potentially develop diabetes, are reason enough to develop proper coping mechanisms with stress, perceived and actual, to make sure your body physiologically is as optimal as it can be. Interestingly, though, there are some studies demonstrating that elevated cortisol level also increases what we call visceral fat. Now, visceral fat is bad fat. This is the fat in between your organs. And the higher that visceral fat level goes, the more likely you are to develop cardiovascular disease. Again, another reason to consider keeping your cortisol under proper levels and proper management. And if this wasn't enough for you to consider looking closer at your cortisol, how about this? Chronic cortisol levels also lead to increased muscle wasting. Increased muscle wasting in the sense of your body with chronic cortisol elevation will begin to break down protein, aka break down your muscle to free up more energy because it thinks it's under attack. And at some point, it will free up anything it can to increase energy levels, including your hard-earned muscle. Now, think about this. If you start to break down muscle and you have muscle wasting, you're going to naturally become more frail, more weak. Now you're more at risk of things like falls, fractures, and just overall injuring yourself. And God forbid you do injure yourself, you have delayed wound healing because of what we talked about earlier. So it's just a terrible feedback cycle, guys. Guess what else is potentially affected? Your bone. That's right. With elevated cortisol levels, you have decreased bone deposition, increased risk of osteoporosis. So now you have muscle wasting, you have decreased bone density, potential osteoporosis. Let's say you trip and you fall because you're so weak. Now, not only are you going to get injured, but you have an increased risk of fractures and you're going to take forever to heal. And hey, you might even have diabetes at this point too. So this is all just a horrible little combination of manifestations of elevated and unmanaged cortisol. Cortisol can also affect your cognitive function. Chronically elevated cortisol levels have been shown to decrease executive function, decrease cognition, and decrease memory. So what does this mean? Have you ever noticed how when you're stressed, you just can't really figure out sometimes simple stuff, things that are normally are no big deal, but it just takes you forever to compute it, or you can't really figure it out, and you maybe need help, or you need longer time to do it, or whatever the case may be. This is all because your cognition is adversely affected by elevated cortisol. So now you're looking at cognitive difficulties as well as physical difficulties. There's actually studies showing that chronically elevated cortisol levels can affect certain parts of your brain that are directly related to cognition and memory. Chronically elevated cortisol levels also have a relationship with cardiovascular disease. They've been known to increase blood pressure chronically, increase inflammation chronically, and all of this can lead to increased cardiovascular disease, increased risk of stroke, and increased risk of overall heart disease. So, what can we do about it? Most importantly, let's talk about rituals and routines. Now that we have an understanding of what cortisol is, why it's so important for you to literally survive and stay safe, and what can happen if it's not properly managed, right? Again, a very tightly regulated hormone. So we have the ability to really manage it by coping with stress. That's the number one thing you can do. Here are some practical tips and tricks that you can use immediately after this video that are either free or inexpensive, and you can apply right away. So let's get into it. Number 1, meditation. Number 2, deep breathing. And number 3, progressive muscle relaxation. Now, without getting specific into what these 3 things are, which we'll talk about later, think about it like this. These 3 things, meditation, deep breathing, and muscle relaxation, they all not only create just a general calm physiology in you to begin with, but medically and physiologically speaking, they activate something called the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is more of the calming, relaxing part of your nervous system. These 3 activities have been shown to directly increase parasympathetic activity, leading to increased relaxation, leading to better stress coping and better stress management. The better you cope and manage your stress, the less likely you are to have elevated cortisol levels chronically. The next thing you can do is regular exercise. In addition to all of the abundant benefits of exercise, both aerobic and anaerobic exercise has been demonstrated to decrease cortisol levels. Now, how does this work? Well, aerobic exercise has been shown to increase endorphin levels. And by increasing endorphin levels, this has been shown to help manage cortisol in a very healthy way. Anaerobic exercise has been shown to increase muscle tissue and repair. And these activities have also been shown to increase cortisol management in a very, very productive way. And ultimately, both anaerobic and aerobic exercise, utilizing different mechanisms, increase cortisol management, thereby decrease chronically elevated cortisol levels. So you're stressed, you're dealing with either perceived or real stress, you got deadlines to meet, you got 2 crazy kids at home, you're dealing with some major life trauma. Exercise is one of the best things you can do to save your life. If you care at all about your life and the people in it, you need to take care of yourself. And the number one thing that you can do is manage your stress. You can do that by the 3 things we talked about earlier: meditation, deep breathing, muscle relaxation. You can also do it by regular exercise. If you love aerobic exercise or if you love anaerobic exercise, it doesn't matter. Just go do it and understand this, guys. You're doing this not just for the stress release, not just to stay in shape, not just to look good on the beach. You're doing this to save your life and be there for the people around you that need you and depend on you. Next would be sleep. Sleep deprivation, in addition to so many other negatives that we already know, has been shown to directly increase cortisol levels. So if you think pulling an all-nighter is a smart idea to meet a deadline and you're so stressed out by it, think again, because chronic sleep deprivation will further escalate cortisol levels, leading to further difficulty with management, and you may develop some of the negative consequences that we talked about. So get your sleep. There's an earlier podcast where I discuss sleep and things you can do for that. I suggest you take a look at that as well. Your diet plays an incredibly important role in management of your stress and cortisol levels as well. Diets high in magnesium, high in omega-3 fats, low in alcohol, and low in caffeine have been demonstrated to help manage and minimize chronically elevated cortisol levels. Omega-3 fatty acids, you're going to find that in really good, healthy, fatty fish. Magnesium, you can find in all sorts of places. Decreased caffeine. Don't have any caffeine-related products after 1 to 2 p.m. your time. And of course, managing your alcohol. Why? Because alcohol itself has been shown to have a direct negative effect on cortisol. The more you drink alcohol, the greater your cortisol levels are on a chronic basis. This can lead to all of the negative consequences we've already discussed. Not only can alcohol escalate your cortisol levels, it can disrupt the diurnal pattern that we discussed. So have you ever noticed if you're drinking for a couple days in a row, you start to not sleep really well, you're tired, maybe you're a little bit buzzed or drunk from the alcohol, and you feel sedated, but you can't really get a good night's sleep? One of the reasons for this is because you've disrupted your cortisol pattern. So now your cortisol is up at night, and when you wake up and you're hungover, part of that hangover is your cortisol levels are going down when they should be going up, and everything is just backwards and flipped around. Another great reason to consider looking closely at your alcohol intake and understanding the effects involved. So your rituals and routines really pivot around stress management with what we talked about today, your diet, your exercise, your sleep patterns, and your alcohol intake. Now, all of these I've addressed in more detail in other podcast episodes, but take a listen to this once again, and you have some tips and tricks to apply right away to get this under control immediately after this video. And finally, as we always discuss, ways to stay resilient and robust. If you want to stay resilient, meaning the ability to fight difficult obstacles, push through them, overcome them, and move forward in your life, you need to treat your body and your mind like a high-powered F1 car. Now, if you're dumping, the worst, cheapest gas into that car and oil, and you're running on the worst possible tires, and you think you can just step on the gas and go, you're never going to win the race. You're going to break down, and you're going to end up costing yourself a lot more than had you done it the right way. For you and I with our bodies, this translates into chronic disease, chronic ER visits, hospitalizations, surgeries, medications, all of these which potentially could be avoided. Treat your body like the F1 car it is, and this will allow you to stay resilient. And some of the ways to do that we've discussed today to minimize your elevated cortisol levels. This will also allow you to stay robust. Now, being robust means the most powerful version of yourself. How can you possibly be that if your cortisol levels are chronically elevated because you're drinking too much, you're not sleeping, you're chronically stressed, and you're not doing anything about it, your diet sucks? All these things need to be looked at. I've always talked about how important the fundamentals are, guys, and this is a great reason why. Understanding how you can get these 4 to 5 fundamental things under control that we've talked about today, that alone can manage your cortisol. And if you can minimize or eliminate chronic cortisol elevation, you can decrease your chance of getting diabetes with high cortisol levels, of having delayed wound healing, protein wasting and muscle wasting, decreased bone density and osteoporosis, just to name a few. These are massive, massive reasons to take this very seriously. So guys, I hope this was helpful for you. If this provided any value to you, share this to other like-minded individuals. And as always, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Dr. Akash Show.